Hi, this is Chicano Darks, and welcome to my channel. There's a time in history where Mexican Americans were being deported from the U.S. during the Mexican Reparation Act, which was a government-sponsored program that happened from 1929 through 1936. These deportations happened under the guise of preserving American jobs for real Americans. Officials in places like Los Angeles were waging pressure campaigns to induce Mexican Americans to self-deport, or they were also working with other officials, federal immigration, to carry out these deportations. Research shows that some families were coerced into self-deporting through persuasion, intimidation, and threats. Others were rounded up by force and even taken from hospitals.
Groups of vigilante type individuals would come onto a Mexican labor camp and say, if you guys aren't out of here in the morning, we're burning you out. So people left. Or in other instances, people would be forced to leave by the sheriff coming to your place, putting a gun to your head and saying, if you don't leave, you're dying. There were those kinds of threats that were actually made, both officially and unofficially, to force people to live, voluntarily,
Mi madre estaba haciendo tortillas de harina ahí, nosotros estábamos comiendo con mantequilla las tortillas calientitas. Nomás llegaron y nos apuntaron con las... un oficial estaba afuera, un hombre estaba afuera y otro entró y le dijo, vámonos, let's go, come on. Mi mamá dijo, ¿a dónde? No question, come on, out. Nos llevaron a los files donde estaba trabajando mi padre, lo agarraron a él también y ahí llenaron otro carro de los que estaban trabajando ahí también, más mexicanos que estaban trabajando ahí. Y en Pocatello, Idaho, ahí nos metieron a la cárcel. Nos metieron a la cárcel por unos 6 o 7 días ahí. Siendo un niño de 6 años, no podía yo comprender por qué estaba pasando lo que estaba pasando. ¿Por qué nos pusieron en la cárcel? No éramos criminales. Mi padre estaba en una celda, mi madre estaba en otra con mis 3 hermanas y mis 2 hermanos y yo. Pero yo nunca comprendí por qué. Hasta en el tren, cuando ya íbamos para El Paso, Texas, decía, ¿este tren a dónde va? ¿Qué va a pasar? Y había como 5 más carros de puros mexicanos también, así, familias. Así. Nosotros estábamos chicos, pero miraba yo que la gente, unas caras muy tristes, porque muchos le estaba pasando lo mismo que nos pasó a nosotros, estaban aventando sin... Los hicieron a propósito para que no regresáramos más, hasta los que habíamos nacido aquí, cuando no nos dejaron traer ni principalmente nuestros registros de nacimiento.
And the coercion and threats of officers trying to get to people to self-deport is currently happening right now, which is really scary.
And I leave with this message: southbound and down. Do it yourself. You can self-deport and avoid a lot of prison sentence. But it's time. Southbound and down. Thank you, Governor.
There's a case of a woman with leprosy that was taken from a hospital and dropped into a border city, Mexicali. Others had tuberculosis, paralysis, or mental health issues, or problems related to old age. More than 400,000 Mexican Americans were deported in Cali alone. But since these deportations happened without due process, there is not an exact number of Mexican Americans that were deported. But it is estimated that around 2 million Mexicans were deported, with about 60% being Mexican American citizens. The first public immigration raid in Los Angeles happened in La Placita Park, which was a sanctuary for Mexican Americans to trade culture. Wielding guns and batons, officers barricaded the park and started demanding documentation and proof of residency. Those who failed to show papers were deported, and more than 400 Mexicans were arrested, detained, deported, and put on a train to send them to Mexico. And for many of them, Mexico was a place that they had never seen before. And this is why I believe the word repatriation is not the right word to use here. Repatriation means to send them back to their patria, somewhere that they're from, which lots of people, they had never stepped foot in Mexico. So this is not fit. This is Mexican deportation and ethnic cleansing, not repatriation. Families were torn apart and many children did not see their parents ever again.
Families were split. Part of the family go back, part would stay. Or you had instances where the father would go back, but the mother would stay in the U.S. because she had American-born children. That happened in our family. My dad left in 1936. When I was 10, I never saw my dad again. How is anybody going to compensate me for that loss? If you can answer that question, then this meeting has been worthwhile. Thank you.
It started becoming very common for Mexican Americans to deny their Mexican heritage to avoid suspicion. Well into the 1960s, Mexicans were afraid to get out of home or even go to the corner store without their papers in fear of being arrested and deported. Many of the Mexicans that were deported had actually fought in World War I for the U.S. Not only that, but the U.S. actually dared to send draft letters during World War I to Mexicans that they had deported back in the 1930s, and they were drafting them. They sent them out of the country, but since there was no legal documentation and no legal deportation, it was not documented that they were not in the U.S. anymore, so they sent them draft letters.
That struck me when I began reading about this. One is the case of many World War I veterans, men who enlisted in the Mexicans who enlisted in the American Army, fought overseas for the United States, had relatives die, were demobilized, and then deported. This is one tragedy. Another that still strikes a chord in me is the raid by the Immigration Department on the El Paso school system, in which 500 children were deported.
The ones who were drafted at the time of the 1930s, they were like 10 years old. But now, since World War II was going on, they were now of age, and they were like, we could use you guys now. Actually, we take that back. Come back here and fight for us.
World War II has begun.
What the United States did at that time was to send out draft notices to those 10-year-old boys in 1931 that were now in Mexico, would send draft notices to those now 20-year-old men to come back to the United States and fight on behalf of the United States in World War II.
Did I understand that right?
You did. You did.
You were deported, but you were asked to come back?
Correct.
To fight for your country?
That's correct. That's correct. When we discovered this, we tried to document whether any now young man who got a draft notice in Mexico from the United States government who refused service in the United States Armed Forces on the grounds that they had been deported 10 years ago in their country. We couldn't document one young man that refused to come back and serve the United States in World War II.
These deportations also harmed the economy. It did not protect white American jobs. It actually increased unemployment and depressed wages. Economists today predict a similar outcome. Deporting construction workers, hospitality workers, agricultural workers would only decrease the GDP to 1.7. There's also very little evidence that shows that these mass deportations curbed illegal immigration at all. Although there was no federal law or executive order for these raids, President Herbert Hoover's administration, which used American jobs for American people as a slogan, implicitly approved of these raids. His Secretary of Labor, William Doak, actually helped pass local laws and agreements that prohibited Mexican Americans from holding jobs. Some laws banned Mexican Americans from holding government employment regardless of citizenship status. Companies like Ford, U.S. Steel, and Southern Pacific Railroad agreed to lay off thousands of Mexicans. The deportation of Mexicans, who were mainly farm workers and laborers, actually decreased the demand for other jobs like skilled craftsmen, administrative jobs, managerial jobs, and sales jobs too. Many people, even Mexican Americans, are very unaware of this time of history, which I am seeing a lot of rhetoric that was said back then being said now, and it's really scary. So protect yourself out there, guys. Really watch out. Make sure you know where ICE is, and take care of yourself, guys. We have rights. Don't let them fool you.
Most people, even all these guys that you mentioned that are now condemning what is going on, say nothing about what happened in the 1920s. Why? They don't know. They don't know. So I often tell my wife, one of the tragedies of being a historian is you know too damn much. You can never be happy if you're going to be a historian. You know, because you know what went on, or you know what might have been. And as we say, those people that don't learn from history, the lessons of history, are bound to repeat history, are bound to make the same mistakes. And that is what we're doing today.